At 8 years old, my biological parents left me at a freezing bus station with nothing but a granola bar. They drove away and never looked back. A complete stranger found me, stayed by my side, and eventually took me in. Only after he passed away did I learn he had quietly left me his entire $3.8 million inheritance. But the story doesn't end there. The people who abandoned me came crawling back from the shadows to sue me for every single penny. Sitting in court, they smirked at me, thinking they had an easy victory. They didn't realize I was about to stand up and say, "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." Before I tell you how I wiped that smirk off their faces forever, please comment "Why" below so I know you are ready. Grab a warm glass of water and listen to the whole story. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the pen scratching across the clerk's notepad 3 rows back. The air smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and that distinct, sterile scent of institutional justice. I adjusted the left sleeve of my navy blazer, took a slow, measured breath, and looked straight ahead at the gallery. Susan, the woman I haven't called mother in 22 years, was seated in the second row. She wore a dark, conservative dress she must have bought specifically for today. It was something respectable, something that screamed grieving family. She sat perfectly still. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the plaintiff's table like she always stared at things she wanted, without blinking, without a shred of apology. Beside her sat Robert, my biological father, his jaw tight, his hands resting on his knees. They looked exactly like the kind of people who deserved sympathy. I didn't feel a drop of fear. The little boy who used to cry in the dark wondering what he did wrong was gone. In his place sat a 32-year-old family lawyer who knew exactly how the system worked. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff's voice echoed off the high ceiling. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Cameron." I stood up with everyone else in the room. I smoothed the front of my jacket. When I sat back down, my eyes locked with Susan's for the first time in over 2 decades. She offered a tight, condescending smile, a smirk meant to remind me of my place. She thought I was still that helpless kid. She thought this was a game she could win through sheer intimidation. I gave her nothing back. No anger, no sadness, just a blank, analytical stare. I was not intimidated. I had stopped being afraid of the dark a very long time ago. To understand how a cheap granola bar led us to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, we have to go back. We have to go back to a winter day that split my life into 2 completely different timelines. The wind off the Ohio River in February doesn't just blow. It bites right through your clothes. I was 8 years old. Robert drove our rusted Chevy Lumina to the Greyhound station on the east side of Dayton. The sky above was the color of old dishwater, heavy and grim. I sat in the back seat, my legs kicking nervously against the worn fabric. We never went on trips. We barely had enough money to keep the heat on. Robert pulled up to the curb, leaving the engine running. The exhaust plumed into the freezing air. Susan turned around from the passenger seat. She didn't smile. She just handed me a peanut butter granola bar wrapped in shiny foil. "Get out and sit on the wooden bench near the lockers," she ordered. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "Wait right there, Matthew." I clutched the granola bar. "Where are we going?" "Your dad needs to buy the tickets," she said, not looking me in the eye. "You know, he always gets confused at the ticket windows. I need to go in and help him. It will take 10 minutes, maybe 15. Do not talk to strangers." I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the biting cold. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the terminal. It smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. I found the wooden bench right next to the metal lockers, exactly where she told me to go. I sat down. I watched the glass doors. 15 minutes passed. I ate the granola bar because my stomach was twisting into knots and chewing gave me something to do. The sweet taste of peanut butter coated my mouth, but it didn't stop my hands from shaking. An hour went by. People rushed past me, dragging heavy suitcases. A man wearing a tattered coat and carrying a guitar case lay down across 3 plastic seats across from me and fell asleep. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed a steady, irritating hum. 2 hours. An elderly woman pulling a wheeled cart stopped in front of me. She tilted her head, her eyes full of pity. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" she asked. "They are buying tickets," I replied automatically. My voice sounded small even to me. 3 hours. The sun began to set outside the large windows, casting long, dark shadows across the terminal floor. Panic started to rise in my chest, hot and suffocating. I stood up and walked to the entrance, pressing my face against the cold glass. The rusty Chevy Lumina was gone. The parking spot was empty. By the 4th hour, the terminal had quieted down. The denial I was desperately clinging to started to crack. A woman wearing a blue vest with the name Deborah pinned to it walked over from the information desk. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a fresh coffee stain on her collar. She sat down next to me on the hard wooden bench. "What's your name, honey?" she asked softly. "Matthew," I whispered. "Who did you come here with, Matthew?" "My mom and dad. They went to buy tickets." Deborah nodded slowly. It was that careful, measured nod adults use when they are trying desperately not to scare you, when they know something is horribly wrong. She reached into her pocket. "I'm going to make a quick phone call, sweetie. Would you like another granola bar while we wait?" I just nodded, tears finally spilling over my freezing cheeks. 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. 2 officers walked in. Following close behind them was a woman carrying a clipboard. She was from Child Protective Services. They asked me questions I didn't have the answers to. They wrote things down on their notepads. Then, the woman with the clipboard took my hand and led me out to her car. I spent that night in a sterile room with bright lights, sitting on a plastic chair in front of a television mounted too high on the wall. I kept watching the door. I kept telling myself it was a massive mistake. Robert just got lost. Susan just forgot the gate number. I was 8. That was the only story my brain could invent to protect itself from the crushing reality. I didn't know the truth. 3 days later, I was still sitting in that exact same waiting room at the county social services office. I hadn't spoken a word since the first night. I just stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, waiting for a caseworker to figure out where to put me. That was the afternoon Joseph Marsh walked through the door. He was 53 years old, wearing a faded corduroy jacket with patches on the elbows. He was there because he volunteered every other Thursday to drive elderly folks to their medical appointments. He had taken a wrong turn looking for the elevator and ended up in the foster care holding area instead. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking around the depressing room. Then his eyes landed on me. Instead of turning around and finding the elevator, he walked right over and sat down in the plastic chair next to mine. "Do you play chess?" he asked. His voice was deep, steady, and completely unbothered by the chaotic energy of the building. I shook my head. "No, that's fine," he said casually. "I'll teach you." He reached into the oversized pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, foldable magnetic travel chess set. He popped it open on his lap. He spent the next 40 minutes explaining the pieces to me. The rook moves in straight lines. The bishop moves diagonally. The knight jumps. He didn't use baby talk. He spoke to me like I was a person worthy of his time. When I forgot how the knight moved, he just explained it again, his tone completely flat, never making me feel stupid. When my caseworker finally came to take me to a temporary group home, Joseph stood up. He reached out and shook my hand firmly. "You have good instincts for the game, Matthew," he said. I thought that was the end of it. A nice stranger who killed 40 minutes with a sad kid. 6 days later, he showed up at my new group home. He brought a library card application he had already filled out with my name, and a paperback book about kids solving mysteries. He had gone to the front desk, asked for my caseworker, and filled out the massive stack of background check paperwork required to become an approved visitor. He came every single week for the next 8 months. I bounced between 2 different temporary placements. I moved across county lines. There was a period where I stopped speaking altogether because nothing in the world felt safe. Joseph never pushed me to talk. He just showed up, set up the magnetic chessboard on whatever wobbly table was available, and waited for me to make my move. Once, he brought a small paper bag filled with those spicy cinnamon candies wrapped in clear cellophane. I loved them. I never told him that, but he somehow knew. He paid attention. When I was 9.5, we were sitting on the porch of my third foster home. He moved his bishop across the board, capturing my pawn, and then he looked up at me. "Matthew," he said quietly, "I'd like to apply to be your permanent foster parent. But I want you to know you have a choice. Whatever you say is the right answer. I completely understand if you don't want that. Trust is something that has to be earned, and I know I haven't earned enough of it yet." I didn't even let him finish his sentence. Yes, I blurted out. 2 months later, I packed my single duffel bag and moved into his house. Joseph lived in a modest, cream-colored colonial house on a quiet, tree-lined street in Centerville. From the outside, it looked like every other house on the block. Inside, it was a sanctuary. Every flat surface was covered in something interesting: a half-finished crossword puzzle, a stack of historical biographies, a coffee mug with a quote about patience printed on the side. The house constantly smelled of cedar wood and whatever he was baking. Joseph baked when he was stressed, which meant we always had fresh chocolate chip cookies or banana bread on the counter. He walked me upstairs to a room at the end of the hall. It had a blue quilt on the bed and a lamp shaped like a lighthouse on the nightstand. "You can change anything you want in here, Matthew," he told me, leaning against the doorframe. "It's your room. That means your opinion on the paint color and the furniture matters more than mine." I didn't change a single thing. I kept the blue quilt. I kept the lighthouse lamp. Life with Joseph was a masterclass in quiet consistency. He drove a 12-year-old Subaru station wagon that he serviced himself in the driveway. He bought his clothes from the sale racks at the local department store. When the kitchen faucet leaked, he didn't call a plumber. He watched a tutorial and spent 3 hours under the sink fixing it with a wrench. I knew we weren't poor, but I firmly believed he was just a careful, middle-class man living strictly within his modest salary. He never gave me a reason to think otherwise. Once, when I was 16, I asked him why he didn't just buy a newer car instead of fixing the Subaru again. He wiped grease off his hands with a rag and smiled. "Things don't need to be brand new to be good, Matthew." That was the extent of our financial discussions. When I got accepted into Ohio State University, he didn't mention taking out loans. He just paid the tuition. I assumed he had drained a small college fund he'd saved up for decades. When I decided to go to law school, he covered that too, waving off my concerns. I promised myself I would pay him back every dime once I started working. I chose to become a family law attorney. I didn't have to search my soul to figure out why. I wanted to stand in courtrooms and fight for kids who were sitting on wooden benches waiting for parents who were never coming back. I wanted to tear apart the custody arguments of people who treated children like disposable assets. Joseph sat in the third row at my law school graduation. He clapped in that contained, genuinely proud way of his. Afterward, he took me to a nice steakhouse, a rare treat, ordered a bottle of red wine, and raised his glass. "I am very proud of the man you've become," he said. Just that. No dramatic speeches. I had to look out the restaurant window at the streetlights so he wouldn't see my vision blur with tears. I got a job at a firm in Columbus. I worked 80-hour weeks, fighting brutal divorce and custody battles. I earned my salary. I earned my promotions. I built my life. I was 31 years old when my phone rang late on a Tuesday evening. It was Joseph. His voice sounded thinner than usual, a little more tired. "Matthew," he said, "can you drive down this weekend? There are some things we need to discuss in person." He was 75. His health had been slowly declining. A bad heart valve, the doctor said, was too risky to operate on. I knew his time was limited, but I aggressively pushed that thought into the darkest corner of my mind. That Saturday, we sat at his battered kitchen table, mugs of black coffee steaming between us, exactly the same way we had sat 1,000 times before. He folded his hands on the table. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told me about the money, all of it, the complete, unfiltered financial picture of Joseph Marsh. He spoke in that matter-of-fact tone he used for teaching chess. No dramatic pauses. No grandstanding. He explained that his father had left him a substantial inheritance back in the 70s. Instead of spending it, Joseph had quietly and ruthlessly invested it. Index funds, commercial real estate in up-and-coming neighborhoods that he held onto for decades. He co-owned a small manufacturing company with 2 college buddies that got acquired by a massive conglomerate when I was in middle school. I updated my will last month, he said, looking me right in the eye. I want you to hear the exact numbers from me, right here in our kitchen, and not from some stranger in a lawyer's office after I'm gone. He slid a single piece of paper across the table. The bottom line number was $3.8 million. I stared at the ink on the page. The room felt suddenly very hot. I sat perfectly still for a long time, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall. Joseph, I finally choked out, my voice cracking. You didn't have to do this. He took a sip of his coffee. I know. That's your money, I insisted, pushing the paper back toward him. That is your entire life's work. Everything you built. He pushed the paper right back to me. I know exactly what it is, Matthew. And I know exactly who I want to have it. 14 months later, on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, Joseph's heart finally gave out. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, in the house he loved. It was exactly the way he wanted to go. We had talked about it once on the porch, a frank conversation about end-of-life directives because I was a lawyer and lawyers force those painful conversations to protect the people they love. He had told me he was ready. I held his hand the night before he died, and I believed him. But standing in the cemetery watching them lower his casket, I realized I was not even remotely ready to exist in a world without him. I took 2 weeks off from the firm. I went back to the house in Centerville and packed it up slowly, honoring every object. I kept the magnetic travel chess set. I kept the lighthouse lamp. I donated his clothes to the local church he had quietly attended for 30 years without ever asking for recognition. I cried in the empty kitchen until my ribs ached. And then, because Joseph taught me how to keep moving forward, I locked the front door, drove back to Columbus, and went back to work. 6 weeks after the estate documents were filed and entered into the public record, the doorbell of my apartment rang. It was a mail carrier holding an electronic scanner and a thick, certified envelope. I signed my name on the screen, tipped the carrier, and tossed the envelope onto my kitchen counter. The return address belonged to a law firm in Beaver Creek, Ohio. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable stutter. Beaver Creek was a suburb of Dayton. It was 20 minutes away from the Greyhound bus station. I grabbed a knife, slit the top of the envelope, and pulled out the legal filing. I read the first page. Then I read it again. My blood turned to ice. My biological parents, Robert and Susan, were suing me. They were petitioning the court to invalidate Joseph's will and claim the entire $3.8 million estate. The legal claims printed on the thick paper were creative, the way pure desperation often breeds creativity. They argued that as my biological next of kin, they had a prior and superseding claim to any inheritance I received. They claimed that since they brought me into the world, Joseph's estate should logically revert to them as my original guardians of record. I dropped the papers on the counter. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it hit me like a physical punch. They argued this despite the fact that a judge had formally and permanently terminated their parental rights when I was 10 years old due to abandonment. They argued this despite the fact that Joseph had legally adopted me when I was 12, severing any remaining legal ties to my biological family. I looked at the address listed for the plaintiffs. It was a house in Beaver Creek. They had lived 20 minutes away from me my entire childhood. They were right there while I sat in foster homes. Right there while I waited for someone to want me. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. The burning anger in my chest crystallized into something cold, sharp, and intensely focused. This wasn't a tragedy anymore. This was a tactical legal problem. And Joseph had spent 22 years teaching me how to see the whole board. I picked up my phone and dialed Carter. Carter was a senior partner at my firm. He handled high-stakes estate litigation, and he was, without a doubt, one of the most ruthless, brilliant legal minds I had ever met. He was also a loyal friend. "I need your eyes on something right now," I said when he picked up. He didn't ask questions. He was at my apartment 40 minutes later, carrying a briefcase and 2 cups of black coffee. I handed him the filing. He stood by my kitchen island and read it in silence. His eyes tracked rapidly back and forth across the pages. He flipped to the last page, tossed the document onto the granite counter, and looked at me over the top of his wire-rimmed glasses. "Matthew," he said, his voice laced with professional disgust, "they have no case." "I know," I replied, crossing my arms. "I mean, genuinely, structurally, they have absolute garbage here," Carter continued, tapping the paper. "Your adoption legally terminated all biological parental rights and reciprocal inheritance claims. They are legal strangers to you. They can't contest a will where they have no legal standing to even be in the courtroom. Whoever drafted this complaint either failed basic estate law in their first year, or they are just counting on you getting scared and offering a settlement to make them go away. They've been counting on me being helpless my entire life," I said softly. Carter pulled out a legal pad from his briefcase. "Give me the authorization. I'll file the response tomorrow morning. I will bury them in procedural motions so deep they won't see daylight until Christmas." "No," I said. Carter paused, his pen hovering over the pad. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Excuse me? I want to handle it myself. I'm going in pro se." "Matthew, you know the rule. A lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client. You're too close to this. It's too emotional." "It's not emotional at all, Carter. That's the point. I need to stand in that room. I need to look at them." Carter studied my face for a long moment. He saw the cold resolve in my eyes. He sighed, clicking his pen shut. "All right, fine. You lead. But I am sitting second chair at your table during prep, and I am sitting right next to you in that courtroom. You are not doing this alone." "Deal," I said. The next morning, I drafted our response. I tore their arguments to shreds, citing specific state statutes regarding adoption and inheritance. I filed a counterclaim for full legal fees, harassment, and frivolous litigation. But as I sat at my desk looking at the blinking cursor on my screen, something kept bothering me. It was an itch in the back of my brain. Why now? I hadn't seen or heard from Robert and Susan in 22 years. They didn't care if I was dead or alive. Filing a massive, baseless lawsuit wasn't just stupid. It was expensive. They had to pay a retainer to that local lawyer. Desperate people make stupid mistakes, but they usually have a trigger. I needed to know the trigger. If you just defend a lawsuit, you're letting the opponent control the pace of the game. I didn't want to just block their pawn. I wanted to take their queen. I needed to know what kind of mess they were in that made a suicide mission against an estate lawyer seem like a good idea. I picked up the phone and made a call I rarely made. I called Gabriel. Gabriel was a private investigator who used to work fraud cases for the state. He was a ghost. Give him a name and a social security number, and he could tell you what the person ate for breakfast on a Tuesday 5 years ago. He was expensive, and he was worth every penny. I met him at a diner on the outskirts of town. I handed him a slip of paper with Robert and Susan's names and their Beaver Creek address. "I need everything," I told him. "Financials, debts, mortgages, employment history. But more importantly, I need you to go backward. Dig into 1994, the year they left me at the station. Tell me what they did the week after." Gabriel took the paper, folded it neatly, and put it in his leather jacket. "Give me 10 days. Took him 11. When Gabriel walked into my office and dropped a thick manila folder on my desk, he didn't even sit down. He just pointed at the folder. "You're going to want to pour a stiff drink before you read that, Matthew," he said grimly. I opened the folder. The first document was a copy of a police report filed with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. The date was February 14th, 1994, the exact same evening they left me at the Greyhound station. I read the narrative section. Robert and Susan had walked into the precinct and filed a missing persons report. They told the police I had run away from home. They described me as a troubled, violent child with a long history of severe behavioral problems. They claimed they had been searching the neighborhood for hours and simply couldn't find me. A troubled child. I was in the 3rd grade. My biggest disciplinary issue was getting put in timeout for talking to my friend during silent reading hour. I flipped to the next document. It was a life insurance policy underwritten by a major national provider. The insured party was me, Matthew. The beneficiaries were Robert and Susan. The policy had been taken out exactly 18 months before the day at the bus station. My chest tightened. I flipped to the third document. It was the payout authorization. 2 years after they filed the missing person report, they submitted a claim. Under a specific contingency clause regarding prolonged disappearances of minors under suspicious circumstances, the insurance company approved the claim. They were paid $62,000. The paperwork was signed by both of them. At the bottom was a notary stamp, and next to it, the signature of a corroborating witness verifying my supposed behavioral issues. I recognized the signature instantly. It belonged to Uncle John, Robert's brother, the only relative who had bothered to send me a generic birthday card when I was 7. He was in on it. They hadn't panicked. They hadn't made a terrible mistake under unimaginable pressure. It was premeditated. They dumped their child at a bus station in the dead of winter to commit insurance fraud. They got away with it because nobody connected a missing runaway report in the suburbs to an abandoned kid found across town. I closed the folder. The silence in my office was deafening. Any lingering, microscopic shred of pity I might have subconsciously held for my blood relatives evaporated instantly. I made copies of the entire file. I drafted a cover letter outlining the timeline of events. I sealed it in an envelope and had a courier hand-deliver it directly to the head of the Montgomery County District Attorney's Fraud Division. Then I went back to prepping for my civil case. I had a court date to attend. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Columbus was clear and brutally cold. I arrived at the courthouse an hour early. I wanted to control the environment. I stood by the second-floor window overlooking the main parking lot, sipping black coffee from a styrofoam cup. At exactly 8:45, a sleek, jet-black Porsche Cayenne swung into the visitor lot, parked aggressively, taking up a line between two spaces. The driver's door opened, and Dylan stepped out. Dylan was my younger brother. He was 4 years old when I was left at the station. He was the golden child, the one they kept. He was 28 now. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored gray suit that probably cost $3,000, and his hair was slicked back flawlessly. He walked around the car to open the passenger doors. Robert and Susan climbed out. Susan was wearing the navy dress. Robert wore a suit that was slightly too tight around the middle. They flanked Dylan as they walked toward the courthouse steps. They looked incredibly arrogant. They looked like a family that belonged in country clubs, radiating an aura of untouchable wealth and superiority. I watched Dylan lock the Porsche with a double chirp of his key fob. A cold smile touched the corner of my mouth. They were playing a part, and they were putting on a hell of a show. But thanks to the deep dive I had done with Carter and Gabriel into their current financials over the last few days, I knew exactly what was hiding behind the tinted windows of that Porsche. That car was a house of cards. And today the wind was going to blow. I turned away from the window and walked into the courtroom. I sat down at the defendant's table on the right side of the aisle. Carter sat in the chair next to me, sliding a thick binder of case law onto the polished wood. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Every argument, every precedent, every counterattack had been meticulously planned and rehearsed. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors swung open. Robert, Susan, and Dylan walked in. They were accompanied by a man holding a cheap leather briefcase. This was Nathan, their lawyer. I had looked up his trial record. He mostly handled minor traffic violations and uncontested divorces in a small suburban strip mall. He looked around the high-ceilinged courtroom, pulling at his collar. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. Nathan and my biological parents took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Dylan sat in the front row of the gallery, right behind his mother, leaning forward with his arms crossed over the wooden partition. I heard the door open again. I glanced over my shoulder. Walking down the aisle was Uncle John. He looked older, grayer, wearing a faded polo shirt. He caught my eye and gave me a slow, sad nod as if to say, It's a shame it has to come to this, Matthew. The sheer hypocrisy made my stomach turn. He took a seat next to Dylan. The players were all on the board. Susan finally turned her head and looked across the aisle at me. She offered that tight, smug little smirk. She leaned over and whispered something to Nathan, who chuckled nervously. Carter leaned closer to me. "Look at them," he muttered under his breath. "They think this is a shakedown. They think you're going to crack and offer them $1 million just to avoid the public embarrassment of a trial. Let them think whatever they want for another 5 minutes." I whispered back, my eyes fixed firmly on the judge's empty leather chair. The side door opened. The bailiff stepped out. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The Honorable Judge Cameron presiding. Judge Cameron swept into the room, her black robes billowing slightly. She was a no-nonsense jurist in her early 60s, known for her sharp intellect and absolutely zero tolerance for frivolous litigation. She climbed the steps to the bench, sat down, and adjusted her reading glasses. She opened the case file in front of her. She looked at Nathan. Then she looked across the room at me. "Let's get this over with," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I have read the plaintiff's filing. I have read the defendant's response. Counselor," she said, glaring down at Nathan, "I strongly suggest you begin by explaining exactly why you believe your clients have standing in my courtroom today." The game had begun. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Nathan, the discount lawyer my biological parents had hired, stood up from his chair. He buttoned his cheap suit jacket, which strained noticeably around his waist, and cleared his throat. It sounded like gravel grinding in a blender. He picked up a stack of disorganized papers and walked over to the podium facing Judge Cameron. I watched his hands. He was gripping the edges of the dark wood so tightly his knuckles were turning a translucent white. He was sweating, small beads forming on his upper lip despite the heavy air conditioning blowing through the ceiling vents. "Your Honor," Nathan began, his voice lacking any real conviction or authority, "we are here today to petition the court to invalidate the last will and testament of the late Joseph Marsh. We are asking you to restore the rightful, natural order of inheritance to my clients, the biological family of the defendant." Judge Cameron looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses. She did not say a single word. She just waited, letting the silence in the enormous, high-ceilinged courtroom stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable. You could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the double doors. Nathan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "It is our position that the biological bond between a parent and a child is sacred. It is a bond that supersedes any artificial legal constructs or temporary guardianship arrangements. My clients, Robert and Susan, brought Matthew into this world. They suffered a tragic, prolonged separation from him during his youth due to severe financial hardship and a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. Now that the man who temporarily stepped in to care for him has passed away, it is only fair and just that the estate reverts to the family of origin. Blood is thicker than water, Your Honor. That is the foundation of family law." Judge Cameron let out a long, slow sigh. It was the exact kind of sigh that usually preceded a judicial execution in her courtroom. "Counselor," she said, her voice dangerously calm and perfectly level, "are you citing a Hallmark greeting card in my courtroom? Or do you have actual verifiable case law to support this breathtakingly absurd claim?" Nathan flinched as if he had been physically struck. "Well, Your Honor, we believe the original adoption was processed under questionable circumstances. We believe that my client's parental rights were unfairly terminated without proper due process back in the 1990s, and therefore, they retain a legal interest in the defendant's current financial holdings and inheritance." "Stop right there," Judge Cameron interrupted, raising a single hand. Her voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Did you read the defendant's response brief before you walked into this building today? Did you even glance at it? Because I did. I have the certified court transcripts from 1996 right in front of me on this bench. Your client's parental rights were not unfairly terminated. They were permanently and irrevocably severed due to gross, documented abandonment. And the subsequent adoption by Mr. Marsh was finalized by a family court judge of this very county. You are standing in a court of law asking me to overturn decades of settled custody law based on a metaphor about blood and water. For the next 17 agonizing minutes, Nathan tried to pivot. It was like watching a man drowning in a puddle of his own making. He circled back to the idea of a family reunion. He tried to argue that Joseph Marsh was merely a wealthy benefactor who wouldn't have wanted to drive a wedge between a newly reunited family. He completely ignored the legal statutes regarding estate law. He abandoned the arguments he had written in his own initial filing. Over at the plaintiff's table, the arrogant smirks were rapidly melting off Robert and Susan's faces. Susan was clutching her leather purse in her lap, her posture rigid, her knuckles totally white. Robert was glaring intensely at Nathan's back, clearly realizing the lawyer he had hired for a bargain rate was getting publicly and thoroughly humiliated. Behind them in the gallery, Dylan uncrossed his arms and sat forward, the arrogant confidence completely draining from his posture. He looked around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. When Nathan finally stumbled to a halt, completely out of breath and out of arguments, he practically ran back to his chair and sat down heavily. He pulled a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Judge Cameron turned her sharp gaze to my side of the room. Mr. Marsh, your response. I stood up. I did not rush. I buttoned my navy blazer, picked up a single, thin file folder from my table, and walked calmly to the podium. I did not bring a massive stack of law books. I did not need cue cards or handwritten notes. I had prepared for this exact moment for weeks. But in truth, Joseph had been preparing me for this my entire life. He had taught me how to control my emotions, how to build an airtight strategy, and how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady, clear, and echoing perfectly across the silent room. Opposing counsel has spent the last 17 minutes talking about the sacred bond of family. But courts do not operate on sentiment. They do not operate on revisionist history. They operate on facts, on verified documents, and on the letter of the law. I opened the thin folder on the podium. Exhibit A in our response is the finalized decree of adoption dated August 12, 1996. It explicitly and permanently details the severance of all biological ties, all legal duties, and all reciprocal inheritance claims between myself and the plaintiffs. From a strict legal standpoint, the two people sitting at that table are complete strangers to me. They have exactly as much legal standing to contest my father's will as the bailiff standing by the door. I paused, letting the heavy weight of that fact sink into the room. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Susan. She refused to meet my eyes. She stared stubbornly at the dark wood paneling of the judge's bench, her jaw clenched tight. However, Your Honor, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, becoming sharper and significantly colder. This lawsuit isn't actually about a tragic separation. It is not about a sudden desire to reconnect with a lost son. The plaintiffs did not spend 22 years looking for me. They knew exactly where I was the entire time. They lived 20 minutes away in Beaver Creek. No, they filed this frivolous, legally bankrupt lawsuit because they are currently drowning in a massive financial disaster of their own making, and they saw my father's obituary in the local paper. They saw an inheritance, and they thought it was their winning lottery ticket. Objection, Nathan yelled, jumping to his feet so fast he knocked his chair backward. Relevancy. Opposing counsel is testifying to my client's character and making baseless assumptions about their financial status. Overruled, Judge Cameron snapped instantly, not even looking at him. Sit down, counselor. I want to hear exactly where Mr. Marsh is going with this. Nathan slowly picked up his chair and sank back into it, looking thoroughly defeated. I turned fully away from the judge and faced the plaintiff's table. I looked right at Dylan, the golden child, sitting in the gallery in his $3,000 suit. Then I looked directly into Robert's eyes. My father, Joseph Marsh, was an incredibly quiet and humble man, I said, addressing the room but never breaking eye contact with my biological family. He drove a 12-year-old station wagon. He shopped at discount hardware stores and fixed his own plumbing. But he was also a brilliant investor and the sole owner of Marsh Holdings, a highly successful private debt acquisition and asset management firm. As the sole executor and primary beneficiary of his estate, I took over the management of that firm's financial portfolio 3 months ago. I pulled a second piece of paper from my folder. It was a certified financial ledger. A month before the plaintiffs filed this absurd lawsuit against me, my firm purchased a bundled package of distressed commercial and residential debt from a major regional bank. It was a standard corporate acquisition on the secondary market. I took a slow breath. My firm now owns both of those debts. Robert's mouth actually fell open. His jaw went completely slack. Susan gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, her face draining of all color, turning a sickly, terrifying shade of ash gray. Dylan stared at me from the gallery, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with absolute, genuine horror. The realization hit them all at the exact same time. It hit them like a runaway freight train. They didn't just lose their greedy lawsuit. They were staring directly at the man who now held the absolute legal and financial right to take everything they had left in the world. "I don't just hold the inheritance you tried to steal," I said quietly, the words cutting across the short distance between us like a razor blade. "I hold your debts. I own the paper on the roof over your head. I own the cars in your driveway." I turned back to Judge Cameron, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "Your Honor, this lawsuit is a bad faith attempt at financial extortion by desperate, underwater debtors who have no legal standing whatsoever. I respectfully ask that this case be dismissed with prejudice immediately, and that the plaintiffs be ordered to pay all legal fees and court costs associated with this egregious waste of the court's time." I walked back to my table and sat down next to Carter. Judge Cameron looked at the documents in front of her. She looked at Robert and Susan, who were now whispering frantically to a completely panicked Nathan. The judge's expression was one of absolute, unvarnished disgust. She looked like she had just scraped something foul off the bottom of her shoe. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "In my 20 years sitting on this bench, I have rarely seen a filing so utterly devoid of legal merit," she announced, her voice booming with absolute authority. "The plaintiff's arguments are not only legally baseless, they are a profound insult to the intelligence of this court. This case is dismissed with prejudice. It is completely without merit. I repeat, so the court reporter gets it clearly on the record, without merit." She paused, glaring over her glasses at Nathan. "Furthermore," she continued, "I am granting the defendant's counterclaim in full. The plaintiffs are hereby ordered to pay all of Mr. Marsh's legal fees, court costs, and administrative expenses related to this filing. If you fail to pay these costs within 30 days, I will personally hold you in contempt of court and issue bench warrants for your arrest. We are adjourned." She struck the gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. The game was over. It was a flawless checkmate. I stood up and began methodically packing my legal files into my leather briefcase. Carter stood up next to me and clapped me hard on the shoulder. "Brilliant," he whispered, a huge grin on his face. "Absolutely flawless execution, Matthew. They never saw it coming." I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I just nodded. I clicked my briefcase shut, walked out from behind the defendant's table, and headed down the center aisle toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. "Matthew, wait, please wait." It was Susan. She had scrambled out from behind the plaintiff's table and was practically running up the center aisle after me. I stopped and turned around slowly. Robert was standing a few feet behind her, looking down at his expensive leather shoes, completely unable to make eye contact with me. Dylan had already bolted out the back door, unable to face the public humiliation of his financial ruin. Susan reached out, her hands visibly shaking, and grabbed the sleeve of my navy blazer. "Matthew, please," she said, her voice cracking perfectly. Tears were rapidly welling up in her eyes. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was playing the perfect picture of a devastated, heartbroken mother. "We're family. We made a terrible mistake a long time ago. We were struggling so hard back then. We didn't know what to do. You have to understand, we were desperate. You have so much now. You have millions. Please don't take the house. We have nowhere else to go. I looked down at her hand clutching my jacket. Then I looked up at her face. I didn't see a mother. I didn't see family. I just saw a toxic stranger who had finally run out of lies and victims. You made a choice, Susan, I said. My voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was just completely hollow, cold and absolute. We were drowning in medical bills and debt. She pleaded, the tears now freely spilling over her cheeks, ruining her makeup. We just panicked. We didn't mean to hurt you. You panicked? I asked, leaning in slightly, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You panicked, drove your own flesh and blood to a bus station in the freezing cold, handed me a single granola bar, and left me there to freeze? You call that panic? She sobbed, nodding frantically, desperately trying to play on any residual childhood guilt I might have still carried. Yes, Matthew, yes. It was a horrible mistake of panic. I stared right into her eyes, stripping away every defense she had left. No, it wasn't. Panicking is missing a car payment. Panicking is taking out a payday loan. What you did was walk into a police precinct and file a false police report claiming your 8-year-old son had a history of violent behavioral problems and ran away from home. What you did was sit in your house for 2 years, pretending to mourn, and then file a claim on a life insurance policy you explicitly took out 18 months before you abandoned me. Susan completely froze. Her breath hitched violently in her throat. Her eyes went incredibly wide, and the fake tears stopped instantly. The remaining color completely vanished from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. You got paid $62,000 to throw me away like garbage. I whispered, making sure only she and Robert could hear the words. Did you really honestly think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I was still that stupid little kid sitting on the bench? Robert took a sudden step backward, his legs hitting one of the solid wooden benches. He looked terrified. He knew it was over. I reached up and firmly pulled my arm out of her grip. Never contact me again. I turned my back on them and walked out the heavy doors, leaving them standing right there in the absolute ruins of their own making. I walked down the long marble hallway, pressed the button for the elevator, rode it down to the ground floor, and pushed through the revolving glass doors into the crisp, biting afternoon air. Carter walked out of the building a moment later, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee he had grabbed from the lobby cart. He handed me one with a nod. We walked together in silence toward the massive visitor parking lot. As we approached my car, I heard shouting. Loud, frantic shouting. I stopped and looked over to my right. The sleek, jet-black Porsche Cayenne that Dylan had driven to the courthouse to show off his fake wealth was no longer parked aggressively across 2 spots. It was currently hooked up to the back of a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck. A burly man wearing a high-visibility yellow vest was ratcheting the heavy metal winch cables to the front axle of the luxury SUV. Dylan was standing on the asphalt, screaming at the top of his lungs at the tow truck driver. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned. His silk tie was crooked, and his face was bright red with absolute rage. You can't do this. Do you know who I am? Dylan yelled, waving his arms wildly. I have the money. The bank wire transfer is just delayed. Put the car down right now or I'll sue you. The tow truck driver didn't even bother to look at him. He just kept ratcheting the thick nylon straps tight over the tires. Buddy, he said in a bored voice, you're 4 months behind on the payments and the bank issued the repo order a week ago. Call the number on the yellow sticker on your window. Step back from the vehicle immediately or I'm calling the cops to cite you for interference. Dylan stood there, completely helpless, his mouth opening and closing as the hydraulic lift whined loudly and pulled the ultimate symbol of his fake, arrogant wealth up onto the flatbed. He spun around and saw me standing 50 feet away, holding my coffee, watching him. All the arrogance, all the smug superiority he had paraded into the courtroom an hour ago was completely gone. He looked incredibly small, pathetic. He broke eye contact immediately, shoved his trembling hands deep into his pockets, and walked quickly back toward the courthouse doors to find the parents who could no longer bail him out of his failures. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Tasted fantastic. The justice system is notoriously a slow, grinding machine. It takes time to process heavy paperwork, to interview witnesses under oath, and to build absolutely airtight criminal cases. 2 weeks after the civil trial ended, I was sitting at my desk in my office, drafting a complex custody agreement for a pro bono client. My cell phone buzzed loudly on the desk. It was a text message from Carter. It just said, "It's done." I set my pen down. I leaned back in my chair. I knew exactly what that short message meant. Gabriel, my private investigator, had told me the district attorney's fraud division was finally making their move today. At that exact moment, 20 miles away in Beaver Creek, 2 unmarked police cruisers pulled aggressively into the driveway of the house that my firm was actively foreclosing on. Heavily armed detectives knocked loudly on the front door. When Robert opened it, they didn't ask politely to come inside. They grabbed his arms, spun him around, and placed him and Susan in handcuffs right there on the front porch. They read them their Miranda rights loudly on the front lawn in full view of all their wealthy neighbors. The criminal charges were severe and inescapable. 2 counts of felony insurance fraud, filing a false police report, and fraudulent misrepresentation. Later that same afternoon, another set of state detectives paid a surprise visit to Uncle John's corporate workplace. They walked right past the receptionist and pulled him out of a senior staff meeting to question him about his sworn signature on a 1994 insurance claim, corroborating a completely fake story about a violent runaway child. Perjury has a statute of limitations, but actively participating in an ongoing criminal fraud conspiracy opens up a whole different set of catastrophic legal consequences. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime for 22 years. They thought time had successfully buried their terrible sins. But time doesn't bury the truth. It just waits patiently for someone to finally start digging. By the time spring rolled around, the air in Ohio finally started to warm up, melting the last stubborn patches of dirty, gray snow off the sidewalks. I had spent the entire winter dealing with the massive fallout of my past. I authorized the final foreclosure on the Beaver Creek house. I liquidated the bad debt from Dylan's failed company. And I watched with quiet satisfaction as the criminal indictments against my biological parents moved swiftly through the federal courts. But I didn't want my life, or my legacy, to be permanently defined by revenge. Joseph hadn't saved me from that freezing bus station just so I could become a bitter, angry man destroying people in courtrooms. He saved me to show me what real, unconditional kindness looked like. It was time to build something entirely new. I used a very significant portion of the inheritance money to officially establish the Joseph Marsh Foundation. I leased a large, bright, welcoming office space downtown. I explicitly didn't want it to look like a sterile, intimidating law firm. I painted the walls warm, calming colors. I bought soft, comfortable couches, and I filled the front waiting room with books, art supplies, and toys. The core mission of the foundation was direct, specific, and relentless. We provided top-tier, aggressive legal representation completely free of charge to children in the foster care system who were caught in the middle of vicious family court proceedings or abusive custody battles. Kids trapped in the system often have social caseworkers who are massively overworked and court-appointed guardians ad litem who barely even know their first names. These kids sit in terrifying courtrooms while angry adults argue about them, as if they are pieces of antique furniture to be divided up. I wanted to change that reality forever. I wanted to make absolutely sure that when a terrified kid walked into a courtroom, they had a sharp, dedicated lawyer standing right next to them whose only job, whose only loyalty was entirely to them. I walked away from a massive, lucrative promotion track at my corporate firm, giving up a huge salary to run the foundation full-time. Carter called me crazy, but he still volunteered his weekends to help us litigate the most complex estate and custody cases. One afternoon in late May, I was sitting in my new office. The door was open, and I could hear the phones ringing steadily at the reception desk. My assistant gently knocked on the doorframe and walked in, leading a little boy by the hand. He was 8 years old. He was wearing a faded superhero t-shirt and jeans that were a little too short for his legs. He clutched a small, battered blue backpack tightly to his chest. His caseworker had brought him in because his parents were going through a brutal, drug-fueled divorce, and both sides were maliciously trying to use him as leverage to extract more alimony. He sat down slowly in the large leather chair directly across from my desk. He looked straight down at the floor, his shoulders hunched up to his ears, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. He was vibrating with that specific kind of silent, terrified anxiety I remembered all too well from my own childhood. I didn't start talking about legal strategy. I didn't ask him hard, invasive questions about his parents. I reached slowly into my bottom desk drawer. I pulled out Joseph's small, magnetic travel chess set. I opened it carefully and set it on the edge of the mahogany desk right between us. "Do you know how to play?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low, warm, and steady. He slowly shook his head, keeping his eyes glued to his worn-out sneakers. "No, that's perfectly okay," I said casually, moving a white pawn forward. "I can teach you. It's actually a lot of fun. The piece that looks like a castle is called a rook, and it moves in straight lines. The one with the pointy hat is the bishop, and it moves diagonally." He finally looked up, his wide eyes darting to the black and white board and then cautiously up to my face. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. "Listen to me very carefully," I told him, making sure he heard every single word. "You don't have to worry about what's happening out there in the hallway. You don't have to worry about the judge, or your parents, or the other lawyers yelling at each other. I am your lawyer. That means I work for you and nobody else in the world. I am right here for you." I saw a tiny, almost imperceptible release of tension in his narrow shoulders. He let out a small breath. It was the very beginning of trust. It was the exact same look of fragile hope I must have given Joseph 24 years ago in that depressing social services waiting room. The cycle of generational trauma had finally stopped with me. I was making damn sure of it every single day. The criminal cases against Robert and Susan concluded rapidly. Facing an absolute mountain of overwhelming documentary evidence from Gabriel's investigation, and completely unwilling to risk a highly publicized jury trial that would put their horrific abandonment of an 8-year-old on public display, they took a plea deal. They were sentenced to federal prison for the insurance fraud. The bank finalized the foreclosure on the Beaver Creek house, and they lost every single dime they had ever hoarded. Dylan, totally stripped of the financial safety net he had leached off his entire life, was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The last I heard through the legal grapevine, the former golden child was working a grueling minimum wage retail job, desperately trying to pay off his massive mountains of consumer debt. Uncle John managed to avoid jail time by turning state's evidence and cooperating fully with the prosecution, but he was heavily fined and forced into an early, impoverished retirement. A few days before he was officially sentenced, he sent a long, rambling, handwritten letter to my office. He begged for my forgiveness. He claimed Robert had manipulated him, that he didn't know the full extent of the fraudulent plan, that he had always loved me deep down in his heart. I read the letter exactly once. I didn't feel a shred of anger. I just felt a profound, heavy sense of pity for a man so incredibly cowardly, he couldn't even own his own mistakes. I walked over to the corner of my office, fed the letter directly into the paper shredder, and listened to the blades destroy his excuses. I never replied. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself to find internal peace. It absolutely does not mean you have to let toxic people back into your life, and it certainly doesn't mean you step in to save them from the righteous consequences of their own terrible actions. I sit at my desk most mornings before the office gets busy, watching the bright sunrise over the city skyline. The office is peaceful and quiet. Right in the center of my massive mahogany desk sits Joseph's old magnetic travel chess set. I never put it away in a drawer. It is always set up mid-game, a complicated arrangement of pieces scattered across the checkered board. Joseph always left it exactly like that at his house. He used to tell me that a half-finished game was a vital reminder that life is a series of complex problems waiting to be solved. It requires endless patience, sharp attention, and the willingness to step back and see the whole board clearly. He taught me how to take my time, how to resist the emotional, reactive move that feels deeply satisfying in the heat of the moment, but costs you the entire game later down the line. He taught me how to think 3 full steps ahead without ever losing track of exactly where I was standing right now. I think about him every single day. I think about a quiet man who took a wrong turn looking for an elevator, walked into a room full of broken, discarded kids, and decided to sit down next to a silent 8-year-old boy. He pulled a simple chess set out of his jacket pocket like it was the most natural thing in the world, and in doing so, he completely rewrote the entire trajectory of my existence. Life is entirely shaped by the smallest, most seemingly insignificant choices. A wrong turn in a hallway, a peanut butter granola bar, a wooden bench by a set of metal lockers. My biological parents chose pure greed. They chose themselves over their own flesh and blood. They looked at their child and saw nothing but a financial liability they could cash in for $62,000. Joseph chose patience. He chose radical kindness. He looked at a terrified stranger and saw a son. The difference between those two choices isn't just a legal victory in a courtroom or a massive financial inheritance. The difference between those two choices is the entire shape and purpose of my life. It is the very reason I can sit across from frightened children today and promise them that the darkness won't last forever. Surviving the storm isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of figuring out who you were meant to be. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long one, but it's a deeply personal journey I needed to share. I hope this resonated with you in some way, maybe reminding you that the family you choose is often infinitely stronger than the family you are born into. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, having to cut toxic people out of your life to protect your own peace and sanity? Let me know in the comments. I read as many as I can. Now, if you are still here, listening to my voice at the very end of this video, you are part of an exclusive group. I call it the 1% Club. It means you have the patience and the deep empathy to see a story through to the very end. I want to recognize you. Please comment the letter W below. W stands for winner. It's our secret code, so I know exactly who the absolute best members of this community are. If this story made you feel something, please hit that like button and follow the channel. We have a lot more stories to share, and I'd be honored to have you along for the ride. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.